Magic to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, guys, for joining. I'm beaming in here from New Zealand, where it's Friday morning, and you can see that the sun's shining, so it's a good day. I will preempt by saying I woke up with a bit of a scratchy throat, so bear with me if I stumble my words or have to stop for a drink occasionally. Let's get stuck in. I figured I'd start the session today with a bit of personal background, because as well as being a good way to set the scene, it should give you some insight into why this is a topic that's really important to me, and I think that context can be really helpful. So I've been involved in helping turn around toxic culture in several communities over the course of my career, but I also have a personal story about how it feels to be on the receiving end, and that can sometimes be pertinent. So my community journey started back in the late 90s. I studied architecture at university and somehow ended up working as a software engineer at Xerox. And given that I didn't have any formal training in writing code, I taught myself on the job, and one of the fundamental tools that I used to support that learning was online forums. So I found myself spending more and more time in the SitePoint community, which was, well, still is, to be fair, one of the biggest DevRel communities around. And I immediately fell in love with the whole concept of online community. But one thing that wasn't really cool was the way that I was often treated as a young female developer. It was an exclusively male domain pretty much back then, and men were often rude, dismissive, disparaging, and sometimes worse. And I felt really hounded and harassed in a way that I didn't see happening to my male counterparts. And I guess we should remember that this was well before the days of social media as we know it now. And because of that, there was no such thing as community managers. The place was maintained by functional admins who tended to be male engineers, and they didn't really have any concept of what online safety looked like, which, to be fair, wasn't their fault because no one really did. And it was actually this decision that triggered my decision to only be known by my surname. It felt a lot safer in that environment to hide behind my androgyny, I guess. And while that obviously wasn't fair, no one could see the bigger picture, and I didn't have the courage to stand up to my bullies or the support, really. But I decided that I did need to do something about it so that other women and underrepresented groups didn't fall victim to that same behavior. So I joined the team of volunteer moderators at SitePoint, and I started focusing my energy on doing what I could to combat the behavior that I was feeling threatened by. And that started with thinking about how we could use the pretty basic moderation tools. We were on vBulletin at the time, the tools that we had at our disposal to deal with the behavior in an appropriate and effective way. Excuse me. And then we fast forward 10 years or so. I don't want to age myself too much. And I left the workforce to have my twins. And I didn't really have any plan to rejoin it at any point soon. But that didn't quite work out the way I'd imagined. My kids weren't even a year old when SitePoint reached out and offered me a role as their first official community manager. And that was when I really realized that I'd found my new career. So I worked there for a few years. And when I moved on, I took a role with a community agency called eModeration, where I worked as a moderator for quite a few big international brands. And that really gave me a lot of insight into the way that different communities execute moderation strategies, some which were really good and some which were not so much. And it opened my eyes to some of the other kinds of harmful behaviors that can manifest themselves as well in different types of communities, and the effect that they can have on members if they're not addressed properly. And from eModeration, I moved on to work with Rich Millington at Feverbee, where I was both a consultant and the head of his expert communities for community managers. And that was quite a daunting prospect for me, but it did give me lots of visibility over just how rife online toxicity can be and how hard a time community managers have when they have to deal with it. And it was during my time at Feverbee that I realized that so many issues that community managers are facing can be supported, if not solved, by smart software solutions. And so my two worlds collided, that being software and community, which led me to Discourse. And I was really excited to find a platform that was focused on making the internet a safer, healthier place, especially in a time when my kids were growing up. And building tooling to support community practitioners to solve real-world problems seems so obvious to us, but it is still quite lacking in this space. So I joined the team at Discourse 5 years ago as a subject matter expert, and I stepped into the role of co-CEO earlier this year. So that's probably enough of my inception story. Let's talk about online toxicity. So There we go. We'll start with what exactly is it? So I kicked off my planning by having a chat with my good friend ChatGPT, and I asked for a summary. And as always, I was pretty surprised at how well it came out. So I'm going to strangely stare at my screen for a minute while I read it to you. Online toxicity refers to the harmful or negative behavior that occurs in online communities, such as social media platforms, forums, and chat rooms. And it can manifest in various forms, such as cyberbullying, hate speech, trolling, doxing, and the spreading of fake news or misinformation. Online toxicity often involves targeting individuals or groups with abusive or harmful messages that can have serious consequences for the well-being of those affected. It can lead to feelings of isolation, anxiety, depression, and even in extreme cases, suicide. Online toxicity can have a broader impact on society as it can contribute to the spread of misinformation, distrust, polarization, and can undermine the ability of online communities to foster meaningful dialogue and collaboration. So that's a pretty good summary. It covers off bullying, which might be the mistreatment of an individual, or it might be bigger than that, with an entire demographic or psychographic being undermined. And examples of that might be racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, or misogyny, as was the case of my personal example from earlier. And those forms of toxic behavior are particularly dangerous because they threaten diversity and inclusion by impacting underrepresented groups. And the net result of their ongoing abusive behavior towards these groups is generally to silence them, which sadly only amplifies the negative voices further. And it's become reasonably common to see bullying of new members or those that are new to the subject matter that the community is focused on. But there are a couple of nuanced situations that I think are missing from this list, and those can often be the trickiest to navigate. So I'm going to add consistent negativity, which is generally focused towards a brand or a mission. And then you've got your keyboard warriors or your intellectual bullies. And those are those vocal members that really dominate the discussion to the detriment of others. Now, the keywords there really are consistent and dominating. And I'm referring to those long-standing, highly engaged members of your community that answer most of the questions, but tend to leave behind them a bit of a trail of carnage. And it's really important to remember that toxicity isn't a one-off thing. So it can start with one thing, but it's the gathering of momentum that we need to control. I should also say that sometimes I stare strangely at my monitor because that's where I'm looking at my slides. So excuse that. But we're still not done. So there was a study done a few years ago by Carnegie Mellon University, which discusses some other toxic patterns of behavior that we may not immediately consider. And their study, to be fair, was focused specifically on open source projects. But some of these behaviors are definitely wider reaching, and therefore they're pretty relevant to this discussion. So now we have intentionally offensive behavior, insults, disrespectful comments, entitled behavior, making unreasonable demands about features that aren't being added quickly enough or bugs that aren't being resolved quickly, persistent arrogance, imposing an individual view on others from a position of perceived superiority, often demanding that other people act as they recommend. And finally, unprofessional comments. And these may not be overtly toxic, and they may not even be intended to be toxic, but nonetheless, they do create a really unwelcoming and impolite atmosphere, and they may be perceived by others as toxic. And that's pretty important to remember. It's not just the individual, but the wider effect on the community. So while they may not appear to be overtly toxic in isolation, if they're allowed to gain that momentum, they can have a cumulative effect. And that creates conflict and results in unpleasant or unwelcoming environments that really alienates your other community members. So again, we're back to this. Toxicity is not something that lives in isolation. I could call you a nasty name once because I'm pissed off with you, but that doesn't make me toxic. However, if I was to call all of you nasty names all of the time, then it's reasonable to say that that's a pretty toxic pattern of behavior. So why does it happen? Well, there are many different factors that can sow the seed of a negative cultural shift, and that's what toxicity is. Sometimes it might be a specific event that triggers the start of a change in collective behavior. And here are some of the more common types of change events that can trigger this. A site redesign, a platform migration, a company acquisition, or just a change in senior leadership. a software release that isn't particularly robust, an overhyped product that doesn't deliver, or simple things like microtransactions that have been introduced into games. And these are all examples of big change, and people don't like change no matter how well-intentioned it is. So sometimes community members of long tenure feel a false sense of entitlement over your community. I'm sure you've all seen that. And unexpected change can elicit a real knee-jerk response. People start to offer feedback which might be unhelpful to anyone else, but to them it feels perfectly reasonable. And sometimes we see cases where the feedback itself is perfectly reasonable, but the way it's delivered isn't constructive. And when people feel that their reasonable feedback is being ignored, they can quickly become disenfranchised. And if you don't have robust change management processes in place to support your community through those big changes, then it's conceivable that things might spiral out of control. But it's important to realize that there doesn't have to be a specific event in order for negative behavior to begin to manifest. Human factors often play a contributing role. We find that the anonymity and distance that's provided by online platforms when people are behind their screen can lead to disinhibition, and that can trigger behaviors that individuals might not necessarily engage with in real life. In some cases they might. So on occasion, a new member or a cohort of members might join your community and they display some kind of unwanted behavior, and that gathers momentum, and then your culture starts to get skewed. And that may manifest, as we talked about, as entitlement, over-dramatization, commandeering discussions, egotistical behavior, or even just persistent complaining. And it can start slowly with one or two people using aggressive language or subtle bullying tactics, generally under the guise of being helpful. I'm sure we've all been subject to the abuse of a keyboard warrior at some stage during our careers, and I'll show you some examples of that shortly. And that's at one end of the spectrum. But at the other end of the spectrum, ignoring or allowing that dangerous conduct can result in the kind of echo chambers and things that we started to see during pandemic times. And it's that kind of situation that can be disastrous, complicating public health responses and even putting lives at risk. And sadly, toxicity is quite contagious. And if we tolerate it, it can quickly become the norm, and that derails healthy conversation and it alienates our new members. And we'll dig into the social science of why it can be contagious soon. But first, I'd like to talk about why we allow it to continue. And that's a fairly contentious way to ask the question. It probably feels a bit blamey because it does point the finger subtly at community managers. But I do think it's really important that we reflect on the part that we play in these situations, because often we're not actually aware that we're even playing a role. And there are times when we're not. But there's one pretty common situation in which we play a very active role and often don't realize it, or at least not until it's too late. And I'm talking about how we handle those aggressive or rude power users. Any experienced community manager will have a war story about a long-standing member who posts prolifically, but they're not always particularly kind. They might use snarky language, but they answer a lot of questions. And it can be tricky to spot at first. They start off slowly with the occasional impatient or condescending response, which may or may not get flagged by your community. But then things start to ramp up with more frequent flags. And if you take a closer look at their activity, you'll probably have to wade through a bit of a river of ego and passive aggression. And that's a pattern. And then if you consider the one-to-many relationship that that individual has with your wider community, it starts to look like a problem. And that's because it is a problem. But the tricky thing is that that problem has a flip side, and the label on that side says engagement stats. If you're someone that has to report to stakeholders on your community engagement, then it probably seems counterproductive to get rid of one of your most prolific posters. And even if we take the stats out of the picture, we're programmed to support our members, the ones that have lots of knowledge and are willing to share it. We want people to interact and help each other. So maybe we put up with a bit of grumpiness because everyone's getting answers. We don't want to get in the way of that. But we should get in the way of that. As community managers, it's our responsibility to look after the safety and the welfare of our whole community, and that should be our number one priority. No individual is important enough to put your culture at risk, no matter how important you perceive them to be. If you allow it, if you ignore it, you're allowing toxicity in the door. As my lovely mother likes to say, if you allow it, you teach it. Because consider the flow-on effect. Now a new member signs up to your community, they see a few of these disrespectful replies, and they think it's okay to speak like that because this guy does, and he's been a member for 5 years. And this construct is well known in the world of social science. It's a form of behavior mirroring. It's sometimes referred to as the chameleon effect, and it refers to our unconscious tendency to adjust our behavior or our attitude to mimic others in our social environment. And there's a related construct that you might be more familiar with, and that's the construct of social proof, which is where people copy the actions of other people in new social situations in order to be accepted. If someone else is doing something without repercussions, then it stands to reason that it's acceptable behavior. So let's take a look at this in action. Excuse me. This is an example from my days at SitePoint. So I'll give you a minute to scan it. But here's a post from a member that was so valued that he once won our coveted Member of the Month award. And at face value, there's nothing particularly horrific about his first post. It definitely errs a bit towards passive-aggressive, arrogant behavior, potentially unprofessional. But then we can clearly see from the second paragraph of the respondent's post that he's triggered, and it's obviously a pattern of behavior. And then the original poster comes in. He's a lot more aggressive. He's argumentative. And as you can see, I felt the need to jump in and call that behavior out. And so that's one isolated incident. But then if we look at his activity feed, we start to see a pattern of behavior, which is not only not okay, but it's now being modeled to other community members by a person who, as we know, has a title that implies status. And that's not an ideal situation, especially in a situation that relies heavily on behavior modeling to set standards for engagement from other people. And another more nuanced version of this situation where engagement stats and toxicity can kind of come together to create a perfect storm can sometimes be found in communities whose focus is on subject matter that's kind of negative by its nature. As we know, people tend to rally together in times of struggle. And if you don't manage that kind of behavior, it can take on a life of its own. And here's an example of that. This is from a health community. The OP has a situation here where engagement's really high, but sentiment is low. The content is negative. And the respondent there summarizes it perfectly with their comment about venting being empowering. It is, and that's okay, as long as you keep it in check. So I guess if you manage a community that's focused around mental or physical health, politics, religion, or anything contentious like that, you do need to be super mindful of this possibility. And you need to have a mitigation plan good to go. Again, you have a bit of a dilemma on your hands when engagement's high, sentiment's low. You want to encourage people to open up about their feelings. But if you do allow it to spiral out of control, then your community is not going to be a very safe place for newcomers. And the last example I'll talk about in this section is one that we've all likely come across. And that is one that we can take some responsibility for with some education. So I'm referring to the censorship or free speech campaigners. People sometimes tout free speech as an excuse for widely sharing negative views or divisive opinions, similarly inappropriate behavior. But allowing that behavior to continue actually does the opposite. It's been proven to hurt free speech. Because free speech is a protection from government censorship. It has nothing to do with posting in a privately owned community. Communities are not democracies. They're not places where a government amendment dictates that anything goes. They're our spaces to police. We get to make the rules and we have to enforce them. And communities that allow abusers to dominate conversations don't just silence those quieter voices. They also drive away any reasonable or thoughtful person that's put off by the hostile environment that they've just come into. And you just can't empower people to freely express themselves unless you do create that safe space for them to do it. And then there are the ones who will accuse you of censorship when what they actually mean is moderation. And here's a great example of that. In this case, some of these members, this member's posts were flagged multiple times by other community members because they were personally insulting and inappropriate. And the post was auto hidden as a result. And this person didn't like that. So she's come in pretty hot here with the censorship claim, probably because that's easier than admitting fault when she's a bit wound up. But it's really important to call out the difference between moderation and censorship when this happens. Otherwise, we perpetuate the myth. So moderation is designed to ensure that discourse does remain civilized and that discussions remain relevant and on topic. and that behavior falls within the community guidelines. But censorship is the act of suppressing or silencing disagreement or harmful speech. They're very different things. So as you can see from my response at the bottom there, I attempted to explain this to her in rational terms, but she clearly had no intention of changing her behavior. Quite the opposite, in fact. As you can see in this next slide. Great. Here she carries on with her personal attacks, but unfortunately she chose the wrong target. My team got rid of her, but if you note the implication from the last comment there, this was a person that changed their name regularly in an attempt to hide behind that perceived anonymity, and she kept coming back with more and more abusive ranting until we banned her IP. People that act like this don't get second chances. That's really important. All right, here's an example from a gaming community that really speaks to the fallout that can happen when a contentious change like we talked about before is introduced and members feel like their feedback's being ignored. I should note that that these images come from the Wayback Machine, so this is not indicative of the styling of the community when it was live, but it's a really good example of the snowball effect that I was talking about earlier. In this particular case, Microsoft introduced skill-based matchmaking into their Xbox game Halo, and the players didn't like it. And the resulting disharmony started to spill out into the wider community. And collectively, they started attacking the brand in a pretty aggressive way. And for whatever reason, nothing was done to correct that behavior. So you can see from these slides that things started spiraling. Every second discussion looks like this in that community. People really started feeding off each other. So now I've got a community full of angry people. They're feeling ignored. They've started firing up as a result. Moderators are overwhelmed by the negativity and they're silenced for whatever reason. So they start to take a back seat, and that opens the door for the members to take it a step further, and they start abusing each other. And then pile on the fact that any new person that's joining the community for the first time is going to be greeted by this. It doesn't exactly scream welcoming. And the unfortunate outcome in this case was that the community was actually shut down altogether. So probably enough examples for now. Let's talk about how we can avoid it. So at a very high level, there are 3 vital ingredients that are required to maintain the ongoing health of a community. And these are consistent moderation practices, accountability, and positive behavior modeling, which in essence is the opposite of that negative social proof concept that we touched on earlier. And if any of these things are missing or not thoughtfully implemented, then your community could be at risk. I'm not saying that any community without one or more of these things is definitely going to be toxic, but these are pretty well recognized and important gatekeepers. So let's talk about moderation first. There's millions of studies into online toxicity that pretty clearly demonstrate that the most common factor in troubled communities is the absence of clearly documented guidelines and consistent moderation practices. And that probably seems pretty obvious to most of you, but there's an astonishing number of communities out there that don't have clear rules of engagement that are not only communicated when members join, but are just as importantly really easy to find later. Because those guidelines serve several purposes. They help your new members understand what's expected of them and how they interact with the community. They give your moderators a set of rules to enforce, but I think most importantly, they give your moderators a source of truth to refer back to when members start to get divisive. That really takes the pressure off your moderators when it comes to making and communicating difficult decisions. It allows them to judge the behavior and not the individual. And this is really important. Because if you consider the difference between telling someone that they're an arsehole and telling them that they're breaking a rule, which was a rule that they agreed to when they signed up, they're essentially saying the same thing, but one's open to debate and the other very clearly isn't. Another interesting outcome of the studies that I mentioned is evidence that platforms with stricter moderation guidelines actually align much more closely with ideas of expressive and free speech. So let's take a look at an example from my own community and talk through some important things in our guidelines. All right, so we start at the top by reflecting on our collective values, the vision for the community, and that really sets the scene for what's to come. Hopefully you can see this okay. Then you want to have a really clear set of guidelines, down here, be agreeable, a really clear set of guidelines which set expectations around acceptable behavior. You want to be straightforward and you want to be direct. Then you want to talk about your shared goals. You want to bring members on a journey, let them know how and why their contributions count. You want them to feel empowered. You want to help define you want them to feel empowered to help define the kind of culture that they want to be a part of. That's really important too. Give them some ownership. Obviously, you have to outline repercussions, explain what happens when rules aren't followed. And this one's really important because it gives your moderation team something to hide behind when rules aren't being followed. They can say, these aren't my rules. These are the rules that you agreed on. They're what you agreed on when you signed up. And I think one less common one that's spoken about is speak in your own voice. It seems less obvious, but I think it's just as important, because as well as modeling the kind of tone and language that users can expect to see when they join your community, it gives a human touch, and people tend to relate to that much more than a formal set of rules. So we'll kill that and go back here. I really love this excellent example. If you grab the slides after this masterclass, you'll be able to dig into this a little bit more. But it really, it outlines constructive ways to give feedback, which is really important. It gives moderators a really good resource to link back to when people start stepping out of line. So now we've got our code of conduct, which is clearly communicated. So the next step is to ensure that it's firmly and consistently enforced. And that's where your accountability comes into the picture. So there are a few approaches to enforcing your rules, and they should generally be used together for the best effect. So the first is to privately or potentially unofficially, depending on your protocol, warning people when posts are reported. If you don't have a platform that automates that process, reach out to them and let them know that they've done something that contravenes your policies. Point back to your guidelines and explain really clearly why they're in breach. And hopefully that elicits a positive response and you're good to go. But if it doesn't, don't get into arguments. You need to use your authority, and you need to make it really clear that your community isn't a democracy. You set the rules and now you're enforcing them. And if people accuse you of bullying or personal attack, loop in other members of your team. If people don't like it, they can leave, and that's really important. Secondly, don't be afraid to post publicly when things start to derail. Ideally, your platform will allow you to use some kind of obvious indication, like you can see here, that you hold authority as a staff member and that your post is a public warning. And your aim here isn't to embarrass anyone publicly, but it's just to make it really clear to the rest of the community that this kind of behavior isn't tolerated. And that's one form of your behavior modeling, as well as demonstrating to other members or to the members that are involved in the conversation that's getting a bit fraught that their behavior is borderlining unacceptable. Anyone else that comes in and reads this topic is going to check themselves if they're about to jump in. And if there are other people watching from the sidelines, they'll be building on their big picture, the kind of the picture that you're forming of, that they are forming of your culture. And you're sending a really clear message. In the same way that negative sentiment can snowball, so can positive behavior. And thirdly, use any tools that you've got at your disposal. And this is going to be platform dependent. I should probably start with a bit of a caveat to say that the only platform I really have any real experience with these days is Discourse. So these are the tools that we provide, but hopefully you will have something pretty similar. So these days, at a really high level, you can put an ambulance at the top of the cliff with things like toxicity measuring tools or sentiment measuring tools. And AI technology makes these super smart these days and very low touch. They give you great insights into trends at a glance, and they effectively act like canaries in your coal mine. You can see danger on the horizon. Then you have your next line of defense with things like topic timers. If a discussion has enough value that you want to retain it, but things are starting to get fraught, put it on hold for a while, close it temporarily. Or another tool that we have at Discourse is slow mode. This forces people to slow down and take time to cool off and consider their responses more carefully. And often it means that they might decide not to respond at all once they've sort of got over that initial frustration. If individuals are starting to perpetuate negativity across topics, don't be afraid to impose a cool-off period by silencing or suspending an individual. That sends a very clear message. And if they come back and keep doing it, you get rid of them permanently. No single member is worth keeping to the detriment of the rest of the community. I said that before, and I really can't stress it enough. Take this guy, for example. So no amount of warning or coercion is going to shut this down. This guy's on a crusade, and he clearly doesn't respect the authority of the moderator here. You need to get rid of someone like that immediately. Like if we look at his last sentence there, your concept of positivity in thought and deed doesn't do much for me. Imagine how disturbed I am at the thought that I might turn someone off. I like the way I'm doing it. Not ideal. All right, if you start to notice patterns emerging around a certain subject, you could use your watched words list. This will allow you to preemptively take action before a post is even made. It's especially helpful in communities where you don't have moderators working around the clock. You know that these tools are going to babysit for you while you're not there to take immediate action. Automation scripts are another potential tool you could use in the same sort of way. Auto close contentious topics, as a result of specific words being used. And then you've got a pretty blunt tool of pre-moderating the interactions of individual users, but I'd be careful with that one because it's not particularly scalable. You need to have a pretty good reason for allowing someone like that to remain in your community if you're going to have to micromanage them to that degree. Whew, all right, we've talked about how to avoid a toxic culture from taking hold. So let's talk about how we can reset. We'll start by tackling slow creep negativity, assuming you've got into a point where you feel like you're starting to lose control of a situation. There are a few things that you can do immediately, and then you're going to need a longer term strategy to stay on track. So let's speak to these things. Start off by cleaning up any negative posts that attack individuals or break your guidelines. And you can be really brutal about this. Delete anything that doesn't add value. Often as community managers, we're a bit reticent to just delete people's posts because we're worried that they're going to get angry. But if they're breaking guidelines, then that's your job. But one caveat I would make here is don't just remove posts because they criticize your brand. You need to allow a healthy amount of honest negative feedback in your community because it goes a long way to helping people see that you're trustworthy. People are allowed to be frustrated or angry, but their feedback needs to be constructive. So long rants, this is another example from the person we talked about before. Long rants should be closed with some kind of a staff note explaining that the discussion has exhausted itself. You've allowed it to remain, but later on you can go back and remove it or archive it or unlist it unless it has ongoing value, in which case you should be keeping it anyway. And then once you've done your initial cleanup, start using that behavior modeling to your advantage. In the same way that people copy hostility and antagonism, they will also mimic your positivity and your optimism. I really love this quote. I'll give you a minute to read it. This is from a community manager that I worked with a few years ago to help combat some endemic negativity that was coming into her community. And I reached out to her a couple of weeks ago when I was doing my research for this talk to see how it was going. And here are some excerpts from her response. So you can see from the first quote that she successfully managed a keyboard warrior with a temporary suspension. Then she put into plan her action plan to close topics that were derailing. And it had the positive side effect of opening up the door for others who now felt safe to voice their opinions. And then we can see here that she employed that behavior modeling to turn her culture around and started to rebuild. And it was a huge success. All right, now let's talk about what to do in the case of a toxic response to change. If you find yourself in a situation where things are escalating quickly due to a specific incident, you need to act really, really quickly. You should contain all the related discussions in one place, because the last thing you want is that kind of stream of vitriol on your homepage like we saw with the Halo community earlier. And then you need to respond quickly, acknowledging people's frustration. Don't ignore them, don't argue with criticism, but clearly communicate that only constructive feedback is appreciated and that no rudeness will be tolerated. I know that you're not having time to read this, but check the slides out later. Don't make promises that you can't keep, but do make sure that you manage people's expectations. It's okay to say, hey, I'm working on the background on a solution and I'll update you soon. Be really honest, be vulnerable, call it out. Transparency is how you build your trust. If you're opaque, people are going to form assumptions about whether something's fair or honest. But if you're transparent and share the details, then anyone that calls you out is going to look like the arsehole, right? But I do recognize that there are times when other stakeholders might try and shut you down or redirect your course of action. And that's difficult and nuanced depending on your brand. But my advice is to try as hard as you can to hold your line. Explain why you're taking the approach that you're taking. Emphasize the importance of transparency and take ownership of your role in your agency. You are hired to manage the community. It's your wheelhouse and you're the one that knows it best. So if you're railroaded, you lose your autonomy, you risk losing control and potentially the respect of your members, and that's a pretty fast track to failure. Okay, we're coming towards the end. You need to have a mitigation plan. Let's talk about putting one together so that your moderators know that if they do see trouble on the horizon, they've got something to lean on. It's smart to have a plan like this in your back pocket so that when you're pressured, you don't have to scramble. When you're triggered and not thinking clearly, you've got something to lean on. And it also gives your team the confidence to take action without worrying that they might get things wrong if you're not around. So you want to agree on this plan ahead of time, and you want to work with your team so that everyone's on the same page, and then revisit it often and make sure that you store it somewhere that's easy to find. And so this is going to look a little bit different for everyone. You'll need to tailor it to suit your own community and situation. Okay, so at the top level, ensure your code of conduct. We've talked about that a lot. Make sure it follows the rules we talked about earlier. Make sure it's highly visible to the community, and that ensures that you always have something to refer to when policing becomes necessary. Then sketch out a basic change management plan that you can lean into when you need it. You'll be able to Google, there's millions of templates for change management plans, and they're all reasonably similar. They include what, why, when, where to get more info components. So yeah, I recommend having something like that in the background, or at least having thought and talked about it. Then you want to communicate change early and gather feedback if it's appropriate. But it is really important to make it clear that not all feedback will necessarily be implemented. Otherwise, you're just going to get people getting more and more wound up. But make sure that that they know that you are listening. Potentially have some templated responses that you can use that take into account different situations. And these should include both public messaging when things get heated and private messaging to members if you need to get in the way of that potential kind of new pattern of behavior that you see happening. Have regular discussions with your moderators. Make sure everyone feels empowered to take action, especially if they find themselves as a first responder when something goes wrong and they don't have the rest of the team to lean on. You might want to run training sessions if you have a high-risk community particularly. Be really vigilant about shutting down negativity fast. Have an agreed-upon course of action that all moderators understand. And don't be afraid to involve other people from your organization. If your community team's being attacked, maybe involve an executive. Sometimes all it takes to shut down a really heated situation is recognition from the brand, people feeling like someone is actually listening outside of just your team. And last but definitely not least, trust your gut. Trust your team and trust your gut. You guys know what you're doing. You've been in the weeds for all of the time. And yeah, it's important to remember that even though you make mistakes, you do know what you're doing. It's your job. I'm going to close with this slide, which hopefully you'll be able to grab after the session. These are a couple of really interesting discussions that I've had over the years with somebody that identified as an intellectual bully. And in these discussions, he talks quite a lot about how he feels, why he responds in the way that he does, and most importantly, some really good kind of ways to manage that behavior in a way that would make him respond in a positive way. So yeah, I'd recommend having a read of those. if you get an opportunity. And with that, I am done. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I think, Sujin, you were going to field questions for me. Is that right? I apologize. I have not been watching the chat while we've been going.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Huck, thank you so much for such an insightful presentation. Just from the chat, I can see many of us really resonate with what you've shared, and I hope that many of you feel equipped and empowered with the right tools to manage your communities. And so I'm very excited to dive into our Q&A session. And so for any one of you tuning in or joining us, please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A tab. I'll be going in order of the ones that have been most upvoted. So please feel free to submit them, and I'll just be going down the list. So let's go ahead and get started. So our first question is, what is the best way to respond as a community manager when toxic rule breakers are glorified by other users who are not aware of the violations of those rule breakers?
Oh, that's a very good question. So I assume we're talking about someone that's being moderated or managed in the background, but that isn't obvious to the wider community. Yeah, I haven't been in that situation, so I'm just gonna talk about what I would probably do if I was shooting from the hip. I think you do need to call things out publicly, because other people can see that pattern of behavior is forming. And so if people are glorifying it, then I don't think there's anything wrong with going in and saying, hey guys, this isn't in line with what we believe. I think that we do tend to feel worried about public posting and things like that, because maybe it's going to imply to the wider community that there's something wrong in the background. But I think that honesty and transparency that I talked about before is really important. Whilst some people are always, kind of pumping up the nasty people, there will be exponentially more people in the background watching it that don't agree or that are worried about this change in behavior. So I think going in and saying, hey, we're not on board with this. What is it about this behavior that you think should be celebrated? And hopefully that, as I said, will create a safer space for the people that don't believe in that to be able to step up.
Right. And I appreciate you for addressing the fact, Jason had asked a question which you had addressed, and he was asking, do you see a place for a community manager to use reprimanding toxicity in front of the community and in a positive way to help build the community up and make it a better place? As a result, and so you address that it's not really a hush-hush type of situation. No. To exemplify that.
Very much so. I think I will go back to the slide that I said, though, which should always be, and especially in these public situations, that you want to address the behavior, not the individual. So you should never be saying, hey, this person is bad, but hey, the way that these people are behaving is bad. Because otherwise essentially you're just exacerbating the stress or the exactly.
All right, thank you for that. We'll go on to our next question here. Piper's asking, do you have any advice for creating a system that tracks potential microtoxic behaviors? I'm thinking especially of communities with a lot of moderators where keeping everyone on the same page can be difficult. And in addition, it's sometimes microtoxic behavior can develop so slowly it's hard to tell when it started. What is your advice with that?
Yeah, it is. That is a very good point. And I think it is. So I guess there's three lines of defense there. One is hopefully that kind of microtoxicity is specific to a topic or a subject where you can be watching words, so that not necessarily to moderate the person, but so that it's drawn to your attention. One thing that we do quite a lot in our community as well is keep really good staff notes about individuals, so that anybody else that's coming in can immediately see that there is some kind of a staff note there, and that we have discussions behind the scenes that you can pin to that person's profile, so that somebody else coming, because that is important, discussion across your moderation team, and having that cohesion of messaging and that understanding of potential people. And also the third point would be quite often now, sort of, we're using AI a lot at Discourse for sentiment and toxicity tracking, and it can be very specific. So that's a very good sort of, as I said before, ambulance at the top of the cliff.
It is, and it really depends. I mean, there are community teams where it consists of one member, and that in itself is, a lot to manage. But then when you have multiple community managers, as Piper mentioned, that also has a set of challenges with managing and knowing the community members.
Yeah, and I think that you need to be regimental with your training, so that all moderators are keeping those same sorts of notes. And because if one person is and no one else is, then things start to break up a bit. Yeah.
All right. We'll go on to our next question here from Jocelyn. Jocelyn asks, how do you feel about consequence escalations? Warnings, then mute, then ban, then permanent removal, etc. What are your thoughts or initial feelings on that?
Yep. I'm a big purporter of a three-strike rule, except in the sort of situation that you saw when that lady before kept coming back with new names. And I mean, I think it depends as well. It depends on how big the initial insulting behavior was. Like, if somebody comes in and they are personally insulting and using awful language, then you've got to make a call about whether you think that they are going to be talked down. But otherwise, no, I do. I think, as we saw from the example of the community manager that has turned the toxic behavior in her community around, that 2-day suspension was all it took for that person to start to behave in a better way. And again, I think that provided you have documented somewhere that is the repercussions of that kind of behavior, you will be silenced. Then you will get a temporary suspension, and then you're gone. Then that's fine. Yeah. I think that's it. I think ideally, like, we do want to try and change behavior. We don't just want to get rid of nasty people. Ideally, we can kind of mentor them into better behavior. We should always assume no malice. We should always assume that someone's having a bad day or someone's triggered by a particular incident, not that they're just a bad person, but sadly there are some bad people.
Got to do what you got to do, but I appreciate the mentality of working alongside the community and working with people. And so
exactly.
And let's talk about the guidelines you mentioned. We had a really interesting question from Venya in the chat. And she says, it's interesting how explanatory you are about your guidelines. And often this is necessary in big organizations, but many times they're not fond of being explicit where they can take advantage of vague language. And so she'd love to hear where you sit on that dialectical tension. How much should organizations explain the guidelines and go in depth with the details?
Yeah, I think some of it will depend on your organization, your brand, or the nature of your community as well. I mean, in some communities of professionals, you probably don't need to go, like a CFO community, you probably don't need to explain that they're not allowed to swear at each other. So I think you've got to read your room. I think that having very clear, concise boundaries and guidelines is important. But again, I think I mentioned that speaking in your own voice is also important, because that's the beginning of that behavior modeling. So you don't want to have such verbose guidelines that people just can't be bothered even reading. Like, you want things to be very clear. But I do think that you need to assume you're communicating to the lowest common denominator.
Absolutely. All right. And we have a question from Drew here, who's asking, do you think it is still worth removing a member that is toxic towards the community manager themselves, but not necessarily to other community members?
Yes, I do. I absolutely do. for a start, it speaks to a lack of respect. But also, if you were to flip it over and say, would you remove a community member that was only rude to one other community member? I think the answer is yes, because that behavior is not okay regardless. So it shouldn't matter whether it's you or someone else in the community. If like that, it's your community, it's your workplace, it's the space that you have to spend all of your time in. Nobody wants to feel anxious about having to go to work because there's a bully in their workplace.
Exactly.
And
I mean, they're part of the community as well. They are managing the community. That's
exactly.
Thank you. All right, we have a few more questions we can take here. Let's see. We have one from Katie. Do you have any tips for explaining an increase in enforcement? So that's an uncomfortable topic, right? Explaining that, especially with long-standing members who have, quote unquote, towed the line in the past. How do you bring that up? How do you do that?
So I really like, if you get a chance to look through the slide deck later, there was one example from a community manager that had come in with that this is how to make constructive feedback post, and that hadn't been there from the start. They put that in when they started to notice that there was sort of escalating behavior within the community. And so that was a really good way to call to account individuals that were a problem in a way that wasn't specifically targeting them. But then the second and perhaps more important ramification of that was the rest of the community can see that you are saying, hey, this is a safe place. This is the environment that we want to create. So people sitting in the background, even if they're not people that interact often, are still building that bigger picture of what your culture looks like. So I feel like I'm saying this is part of the response to every question. We have to be confident. We have to be confident. If this wasn't an online community and this was a classroom and you were a teacher, how would you behave if someone, right? Like it, yeah.
Yeah. Do you see, I mean, this is just a question of mine. Do you see a typical kind of behavior of most community managers, and where, I mean, obviously it's an uncomfortable topic for many people. But if there's so many tools that you've given to us, but if I'm curious of, what's the main, like the biggest tool that you would, or biggest piece of advice to empower the community manager in terms of attitude and mindset? Like what would you want to say? What is the hurdle that most community managers and builders are facing? And what is that fear?
I think the fear does come from a bit of I guess twofold, a bit of a lack of confidence around how our public voice is going to be accepted, and also what's appropriate from our brand or our managers or our stakeholders. But I think, again, if we take the online aspect out of it and we go back to, if someone was coming into your home, you would have the confidence to go, hey, back off, don't talk to my kids like that, don't kick my cat, whatever that looks like.
I love that analogy.
Yeah. Like in the same way that anonymity is hidden behind by your keyboard warriors or your bad behavior, like we've grown up with that same kind of nervousness, but it's our job to use our voice. So my number one is absolutely be confident, and imagine, like, your job is to protect the entire community, never to one person, one group of people, one cohort. No one is important enough to allow that toxicity or that discomfort for everybody else to take hold. So
that's so empowering. I really appreciate that. We have a question from Phoebe here, and she asks, what technologies or processes can be used to proactively help surface toxic behaviors that are more or less obvious or don't specifically violate terms? So in a sea of all of the forums and chats and things like that, how is there a certain flagging process that you like to use, or any tools? How How do you do that?
Yeah, that's going to be very platform specific, I think. But I would assume that most platforms these days do have community flagging, and like that's the crowdsourcing. You can't read every single discussion that happens, and so whilst those things are boiling in the background, the number one most important tool is some form of crowdsourced moderation, which is your flagging system. So community members are therefore acting in a way like an extension of your moderation team. So if you don't have some kind of a flagging or reporting system in your community, then yikes, maybe change platforms.
I mean, that's what you would want a platform to be able to help, a builder do. So
exactly.
Yeah, we'll take one last question here. And Vinny is asking, how do you handle moderators and facilitators who are coming to you with fears of something on the horizon being a problem, but when there isn't yet a bounds or evidence to handle it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think you would potentially, are they making it up? I guess that they're seeing something that you're not. So I suspect, I mean, again, it depends how big your moderation team is, but I would have an open discussion. I would ask them to what is it that you think you see? Like, again, you've got to empower your moderators to be able to raise these things with you, and you won't necessarily always be able to see everything, especially in a large community with a large team. So get around the virtual table and have a chat about it. And it's quite likely that person was your canary in the coal mine, and then you're going to have other moderators that said, oh yeah, hell, I've seen this as well, but I just wasn't quite sure and I didn't know if it was time to raise it. Like, someone's always got to go first. And yeah, I think that moderator should be commended for having for having that vision.
It's better to have the open conversation than not to, and then be surprised in the end. So, all right. Well, Hawk, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with everyone, and for all of the community builders tuning in, literally from all around the world. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, this session has been recorded, and we will be posting this on our CMX YouTube page. We'll notify you when it's posted. But hope you all have a great rest of your evening or your days or afternoons, whatever it is. And we'll see you at our next masterclass. So
yeah, thank you everyone for giving me an hour of your time. I appreciate it.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.